Tupac Shakur and Notorious B.I.G have made some of the most influential music in hip-hop and rap. So influential that their music can be included as one of the very arts that help tailor our definition of democracy for Black and low-income communities. As expression is known to be one of the most popular attributes in art and music, Tupac and Biggie have had their power in public to lift and hear those who identify with the common word used in Black communities, underrepresented. I have had the privilege of researching Tupac and Biggie's childhood. It took me a few months to sit down and research documentaries that best stimulate the topic of what democracy means to low-income Black households. The motivation that left behind Shakur and Big was their spotlights. These two rappers were mainly used as an example for what it meant to be Black and grow up in the American dream. While their two stories could be seen as heroic and rags to riches kind of story, you could also argue that how this is not a common American tale. A good portion of residents in the U.S. have a conservative and white American opinion, where they only focus on the privilege and authority they can control, which by statistics and economics and power, it's a lot. In fact, some could argue that freedom comes with a price or privilege, giving Black people only the space of basically renting America, where America is a bad landlord. Upon gazing and detecting for music-related democracies that included Biggie and Tupac, I noticed that only recently have those films been made. Tupac's documentaries popped up through Google research, with the earliest published in 2001. For Biggie, there is quite a downfall in the upbringing of the story. With only one popular documentary created by Netflix, Biggie, I Got a Story to Tell, his flame for being famous has been slightly diminished due to the lack of storytelling from friends and family. I feel that this is worth bringing up in my podcast, as I want to historically provide you, listener, the truth of these two case studies. However, if not even the performing arts of America can see how their legacies are huge, how are we to trust only the newest publication? And why are they only being brought up for retelling a legacy now? With the luck of another new show taking place in 1996 called Untold Biggie and Tupac Shakur's Mystery Murders, I have not only gone backwards in my assignment of making sure all the films you are about to hear are accurate, but provide background and honest context. This show was seen as a truth serum to our murder cases on Tupac and Christopher. I have made sure that before moving forward, you are aware of how willing I am to go into lengths of sharing the most realistic story to my two case studies. This podcast is an introduction on how hip-hop has made us woke and up against democracy, as it was neglected to begin with for Black families. When you dive into the neighborhoods, the streets, the echo chambers of police, and how they felt towards Black people, democracy does not become a part of the picture. Same with justice. African Americans and Blacks are swept away from feeling like we are something essential and pushed to feel like we are still in the Jim Crow era, feeling disrespected and forgotten. This is Analysis 1, and today we're going to also be getting into Biggie, talking about who he is as a person and kind of going on and off script here, but also discovering who he was through lots of the documentaries I had the chance to discover. Biggie is a witty, fascinating lyricist, hilarious and underrated rapper. Even though he has over 30 million sold copies of his album, Ready to Die, he will forever be known as underrated due to our newest generation not concentrating on hip-hop stories and how music was shared from the 70s to the 90s. Notorious B.I.G, aka Christopher Wallace, was only 24 when he was shot after a Los Angeles party held in a Peterson Auto Museum. He was, once again, an infamous, talented rapper, father, and most importantly, the son of Valletta Wallace, an immigrant from Jamaica who stepped away from her country so that she could experience a different career in New York with Chris. In the film, Biggie, I Got a Story to Tell, you get to hear Christopher speak about the truth before his killing. He was interviewed on a couple of radios and recorded during his concerts. What hit me the most was learning about what it meant to be living on the streets like Christopher. On one of the intersectional Brooklyn corners of Mother Wallace's house, there was the left street, St. James Place Avenue. If you could picture yourself as Chris for a second, you could imagine walking through active students trying to make it to school on time, people who use their manners for the safety and making friends with others, and curfews built for the safety of that neighborhood. People were not as kind but polite enough, with decorum, as they understood the point of shared neighborhoods. And then there was Fulton Street. Just turn the corner and there it was. His mother warned him about it. Biggie ignored the cautionary tape and tales from everyone as his friends encouraged him to hang out with him. Now, at first, in the daytime, you might have liked the ambiance of Fulton. It presented itself with culture and people who wanted to talk and maybe get to know you. They didn't have class, as it was a lesser, more homeless income road, but the citizens there would still mind their own work and life, not trying to interfere with others. Basically, minding their own business. Christopher made some of his best friends on Fulton. Biggie showed them respect, and they gave it back. This upgraded their relationships with him to become a part of the posse, the junior mafia in his rap game career. Now, although the street had fair rules, there was one man Biggie befriended who didn't follow them. His name was Roland Young. Roland is better known as Ollie, a friend who started selling crack in Fulton for a while. As he was the nephew of I.G, a man who ran a lot of Brooklyn streets crack sale for only $5, he promised to keep his word to help Biggie sell his supply. As you skip ahead in the documentary, maybe towards the end a little, many of his friends admitted to the tragedy of Ollie losing his life from his uncle, as he shot him from trying to get away with the crack selling business. Biggie had the intentional use of selling crack, even though he had signed his first label with Bad Boy Records. He wasn't making enough to even supply his own groceries or a meal. Puff Daddy Sean Combs was his label producer at the time and confessed in an interview that as much as Biggie tried to hide his hunger, he knew he was starving. When Biggie started selling crack, he was heavily involved with the drug. He couldn't see himself on the streets forever, but knew that if this was the only way to make ends meet, he'd better buckle down and get to work. He would bring home crack to dry outside his room's window and go out for a few hours. When he came home, his mom had cleaned his room with fury and would say, "Why are you leaving all these mashed potatoes in your room? I've thrown them away for you." Biggie ended his drug-selling career as soon as he had children and saw them as the reason for living. He saw it as a chance to change, and he pursued in making his children happy by putting them first instead of his own. He pushed for what he wanted and needed for having a successful and healthy family. That was his most significant achievement for him, having these kids. Biggie's life was always well spent in the rap gaming career. Now, however, I bet a lot of us start to wonder, if the crack crisis didn't hit for such low economic families, what would Biggie have done then during his time? Would his life have extended a little longer? What about Ollie's? When my work focused more on Tupac, I stumbled upon the show Unsolved the Murder Mysteries of Tupac and Notorious B.I.G. This is Analysis 2, here to discover the real story of Tupac Shakur. The show, back to it, the Unsolved the Murder Mysteries of Tupac and Notorious B.I.G. show was worth fancying over as it included who Tupac was. He was seen as someone who supported his neighborhood by participating in popular LA-funded performing arts. As his fame came through his music, he hit through film and poetry. He starred in well-known classic films you may recognize like Poetic Justice or Juice. As his documentary was recently released in April 2023, Dear Mama included the treat of Tupac and his mother, Feni Shakur's voice, and interviews from over the years. A memorable part of the documentary was including the story of how Pac was shot a white police officer the same night of his release party for the song Dear Mama. To set the scene, it was a dark night in California. Pac was spending his time over at a hotel 5 to 10 minutes away from the park. He saw a black man being beaten down and bullied by a white police officer. The poor man was bloody and suffering. Pac was originally discouraged by his group. They did not want him to get involved in the police brutality taking place. Something to also note is that he never really wanted to be involved in the first place, but until he saw these certain actions happening of police brutality, he needed to get involved for him. He ignored his posse, went after the police officer in the park, and got down on one knee behind his car. He pulled the trigger that night, ending the life of that abusive police officer. Once he made it back to the hotel, he saw residents of the hotel looking out their own windows and hallways for concern at the sound of the shot. One of his posse friends says he was in the hotel, calm and collected. He shouted, "Hey everybody, come check out my new song." Dear Mama was heard that night without anyone knowing about the killing. Pac had seen himself as a hero for the black neighborhood cops constantly threatened. His mother was a former Black Panther, so he wanted his roots to meet his rap poetry and lifestyle. He heavily believed in respecting women. It wasn't until after high school he decided to fit with society's expectations and start the thug persona we all know and slowly fell in love with. A question that was commonly brought up with many about Pac was that if he hadn't fallen into the gangster facade, who would he have been? Would he also lived just as long as Biggie? To tie in a little bit more about democracy and Pac and Biggie, we have to talk about democracy first. And this is analysis 3. Democracy has its wits and ends in the cycle of discovering black artists. As you can see in both case studies, these black men grew up in separate parts of America and yet still face the struggle of risking their own lives by participating in violence, selling drugs, and getting into sticky situations that put police on watch. It's a struggle to see black people living in this country when all they've ever done is be present with themselves and their community. When reading the book Democracy Remixed by Kathy J. Cohen, I took away the statement from Chapter 2, Gangsta Rap Made Me Do It. They had said, "Finally, a 22-year-old male from Chicago talked about what happens when he walks down the street in black neighborhoods." They had taken this quote from the 22-year-old male. "If I'm walking down the street, an old black lady will clutch her purse like I'm about to take it. You know it's kind of sad, but that's just how it is. They don't give us the same respect. They don't feel we're superior. It's like we all doing bad things." End quote. It takes hip-hop to introduce black people in America not as a threat, but as serious artists. But only so then can you take it far, as racism and sexism exist everywhere. Returning to the documentary Dear Mama, Afeni Shakur complained about the sexism she dealt with in the Black Panther Party. After all, Malcolm X has always said the most disrespected person in America is the black woman. Mrs. Shakur didn't stop that from her protecting her own son from violence and gangs, as she traveled up and down New York and California just so that Tupac could grow up in peace. The risk she took impacted many to look up to her as divisional leader for the party. She may not have been respected as a woman on the streets, but she was definitely seen as a boss to many. Black women and men are constantly struggled to believe that their presence is a threat to what democracy can do for us in any timeline. You have slavery, the Jim Crow era, and how can we forget to mention the constant killings placed by police brutality no matter the year or decade? The University of Chicago, Illinois reported on a data page, more than 600 people are killed by law enforcement in the U.S. each year. Black people are being increasingly targeted as they struggle to find their own definition of democracy. The question arises for all who claim to be Black or African American in the U.S. How should we trust democracy in our government? Those who are Black and already high in fame and power are being treated just the same. The Black Panther Party sees democracy as a challenge outside of the U.S. Malcolm X spoke on behalf of the party, and his own activists calling through an interview saying that racism can't be only dealt with in America. We have to work from the outside in. This was also quoted from Dear Mama. It has also been said and made very clear that the BPP party is interested in having only Black people govern themselves. I would hope that in the year 2023 and beyond, we think a little bit more practical. Obviously, having the Black Panther Party run the government would cause a crazy stir of racists to rally, and we can't have the same feeling from where we were when Trump was not voted in for his second presidency, causing an incredibly dangerous, highly insensitive party to burst in the doors of the Capitol. We shouldn't continue with having mainly only white people govern the United States, as it does not show the real diversity of this country. So here's my next real honest question. Where is the middle? I was originally inspired to talk about Tupac and Notorious B.I.G's background and how where they came from and how they got to where they were was all not from just a coincidence, but rather hard work. Harder than all the white men I've seen through tabloids of white men discussing the difficulties of making it big. Need I remind you, both of them sold crack at one point to make ends meet for their families. And even then, it wasn't enough for them to have a full meal on the dinner table. Until you've seen hurt and abuse within your community, you haven't lived a life of suffering. You haven't been the lowest of the low, the bottom of the chain, the struggle of the population. We need more artists like Shakur and Wallace so that every person in America can hear what it's really like to not to have democracy being served to you in your own neighborhood. I have introduced my father to this project as he has been a fan of these two rappers since their first songs came out. My dad, Donald Bardwell, agreed to answer some of the questions I had to ask about their generation and what they thought of democracy from a time that allowed rappers to be diverse in story, while also actively promote for a change in lyric. Here he is. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing pretty good. We are on my phone currently, and I'm going to ask you some questions. For the first one, I have to ask you, how much did they influence your politics? As in for Tupac and B.I.G.
You mean the rappers?
Yes.
I mean, they didn't really influence my political aspect of it because considering I'm a little older than they are, I actually got a chance to see what they were talking about in their lyrics in play in life. So in my head, I figured they were just reporting. They were like live reporters in the field, and they were kind of introducing the rest of the world to what was really going on in the inner cities. So I think the democracy and the politicians and everyone else was shocked more or less because they had no idea what was going on in the inner cities and stuff, and they kind of blamed them for that, thinking, they were always constantly saying that they were influencing people to do that through their lyrics, when in reality, they were reporting about what was going on in their cities through their lyrics. So in my head, that's what I kind of got from the gist of it. They were always mad and trying to censor their mouths and all that other stuff, but it wasn't those wasn't the guys that started it. It was the guys that kind of let the rest of the world know what they saw every day.
Mm-hmm. And just to follow up really quick, how do you think like the way you vote now, with whether or not they really influenced your politics of like politically thinking today, how do you think that they would have like allowed to vote now versus how you would be voting, do you think?
I don't know about that. It's because voting is pretty widespread when you talk about who you're voting for. I mean, you can, people that are elected officials run on some type of a campaign platform, and you kind of basically try to see who is in the best interest of the community or who's in the best interest of the people versus, in my head, it's like either the people or big business. So I tend to lean towards the people because, community-wise, it makes things a lot easier or makes things a lot less stressful. So I think that through the rap or through any outspoken type of music or poetry or whatever tends to make me go towards the people because that's who's crying out.
Thank you. And for our next question, to kind of steer away from politics but get more into the definition of democracy, kind of like how you were saying before with people, has their music influenced you to think of democracy in a different way?
Necessarily, no, not necessarily think of them in a different way, but kind of just it kind of opened my eyes as to what they were doing and not really be and make me listen more to the inside part of it and see what track records and make me do my research on the people that are actually running for office, because if they haven't done anything in the past and they're just trying to get elected, then I'm not really going that direction, but if they've had a past history where they were kind of active in the communities or whatever, it helped me to do that research.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And for our final question, this kind of pertains around Tupac's legacy and what he left behind involving with himself in the Black Panther Party. As you and I both know about his mom, Afeni, being a part of the Black Panther Party as elite division, my question for you is, how do you personally view the Black Panther Party, and do you think that they've kind of participated a little bit in what Tupac has messaged his own influence with rap?
Oh yeah, he definitely was influenced. I mean, his mom. So, you know, they've been stereotyped and tagged, and the actual Black Panther Party because of the fact that anything that doesn't, you know, follow the rules of the rest of the politicians are considered to be some type of activist or some type of a what they consider to be, you know, like non-American or whatever. So they tend to only publicize the stuff that's negative. So, but when they started, I mean, their whole basis was to help out the community and make sure people had food and make sure people weren't abused by the police and everything else. A lot of the things that have come full circle around again, because there's a lot of other organizations now, including churches and stuff like that, that are trying to feed the poor or trying to house the homeless and all those things the Black Panthers is doing. But because of their negative connotation behind the way they dressed, which again is like the way that they stereotyped rappers, and the way that they, you know, met together and just did things, you know, without being transparent, then people tended to get more afraid of them because they didn't know what their motives were. They didn't know what the final goal was going to be. So they tended to, instead of listening to them, to break them down, you know, before they ever got a chance to actually prove themselves as being a help. So I really think that his influence in the music was totally influenced because instead of having a house or a place of meeting, he did it through the airwaves. And so that way it was a lot harder for them to control his influence than it would have been for, say, like Huey P. Newton or somebody like that was actually setting up meetings, you know, and he wasn't a musician, so people had to come to him kind of like a church in order to hear what his agenda was or what his theories were or what his message was. Whereas Tupac, they couldn't control his mouth, so it was over the airways. So they, you know, whether or not he was assassinated or whether or not they allowed that kind of thing to happen, you know, they tend to always silence people that they can't control. That's the way I'll put it, including and not excluding President Kennedy. I mean, when you can't be silenced and they tell you to stop and you don't stop, Martin Luther King, all these people, they tend to end up, you know, deceased by some weird means.
Thank you. Thank you for your input, and we appreciate you for being a part of the senior capstone. My mother is also going to be joining me on the pod today as I ask her the same questions. You would be very surprised on the response I received from a white woman, a white cis woman, who grew up after the Black Panther Party and was normally surrounded around a common middle-class neighborhood that was very privileged in their community. Here is that wonderful interview. Enjoy. How are you doing today, Mom?
I'm doing good, thank you. And yourself?
I'm doing pretty good. Are you excited to answer my questions?
Excited, yes.
Okay. With me, I have Miss Catherine Bardwell, also known as Katie Bardwell, aka also known as my mother. And today she'll be answering also a couple of the questions I've already asked previously with my dad, Donald Bardwell. And let's just jump right into it, okay?
Okay, sounds good.
The first question I have for you is, how much did Tupac and Biggie influence your politics?
Ooh, okay. Well, these artists were representing a minority community, and they were very public about what they were experiencing. So for me, it was like eye-opening and almost revolutionary. I was a teenager, and they were shedding a light on situations I did not even know existed or had experienced myself. So that alone, I kind of influenced how I viewed, quotation marks, white America, because I knew I wanted to see my diversity in all of our communities. And I think with the government is where it should start.
I love that answer, Mom. Thank you. I also want to ask you as well, like as a follow-up, not to discredit your use of the term white America, but for you, what does white America mean to you versus Black America, in your opinion?
Well, I grew up in a white town, and there was very few diversity, like other nationalities. And there was nothing at that time, there was nothing in the government that looked that way. So it was kind of like hidden, if you will. And as the media expanded and became more and more into different, not just the main cities, but then also the suburbs and stuff, I think we would see more diversity. And then we started seeing these artists, like these rappers or any other kind of genre of music, start branching out, and you see different ethnicities. And so white America was something that I don't even know which artist it was, but they kind of shed the light on that term. And it was a reality, it was something that I was actually able to understand what they meant.
Yeah, that's a really good answer. Thank you for sharing that. Following up to our next question here, I wanted to ask you, has Tupac and Biggie, their music specifically, influenced you to think of democracy in a different way and to kind of differentiate between politics and democracy? I'm more of like shedding a light, as you used a wonderful term, to democracy as like towards like the people. And I would love for you to hear, I'd love to hear your opinion on that.
Sure. I guess when you think about it and you dive into the lyrics of both of those artists, you're going to hear the voice of the Black community being represented and how they're treated unfairly. They're fighting a fight to not be discriminated against. And it was clear in those lyrics and in their music videos. So democracy doesn't seem to be working for all the people if any of the population of the people are feeling unvalidated and discouraged. And that was clearly what was going on.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And to now put us in through our last question, that is pertaining around democracy and getting to know the parties, as you may recognize the Black Panther Party. I'd love to know your opinion and how do you view the Black Panther Party?
That's a good one. So the Black Panther Party was before my time, and unfortunately it was not taught about in my school years. However, as I get older and have opportunities to learn through more documentaries on the movement or by people that influence my thoughts, I think I've learned enough to kind of be a little bit more educated on it or to pass on my thoughts on the matter. So to me, the Black Panther Party was a movement that was for the people, by the people, just like our democracy is supposed to be, right? The democracy, our term is in our logo, our slogan is that we're for the people, by the people. But the Black Panther truly was making that their term and actively trying to have that incentive come to life. So a few years ago, if you remember, the media was sprawling with communities trying to dismantle the police departments and take matters into their own hands. I think the Black Panther movement definitely led the way for the types of community outreach that are still happening today.
In the end, Tupac Amaru Shakur and Christopher Wallace were still and forever will be known as young legends who lost their lives due to the loss of democracy, taking any kind of responsibility for the damage it's caused in their neighborhoods. I am wishing, hoping, and looking forward to our future becoming bright and a new generation to help bring more awareness in Black communities. Like my mother said, we cannot become democracy, one for all, speak for all, without having the people speak for themselves. I hope that I provided some light to Tupac and Biggie's life. I hope that all your questions were answered pertaining to the mystery of democracy in these two rappers, and thank you for listening.